Chapter 20, Part 1 of an Antarctic Mystery, or the Sphinx of the Icefields. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne, Part 1. Unmerciful Disaster. In the morning after breakfast it was decided that the men should begin to dig a sloping bed which would allow the Halbrane to slide to the foot of the iceberg. Would that Heaven might grant success to the operation, for who could contemplate without terror having to brave the severity of the austral winter, and to pass 6 months under such conditions as ours on a vast iceberg, dragged none could tell whither? Once the winter had set in, none of us could have escaped from that most terrible of fates, dying of cold. At this moment Dirk Peters, who was observing the horizon from south to east at about 100 paces off, cried in a rough voice, "Lying to!" Lying to? What could the half breed mean by that, except that the floating mass had suddenly ceased to drift? As for the cause of this stoppage, it was neither the moment to investigate it, nor to ask ourselves what the consequences were likely to be. "It is true, however," cried the boatswain, "the iceberg is not stirring, and perhaps has not stirred since it capsized." "How?" said I. "It no longer changes its place?" "No," replied the mate, "and the proof is that the others, drifting on, are leaving it behind." And in fact, whilst 5 or 6 icebergs were descending towards the south, ours was as motionless as though it had been stranded on a shoal. The simplest explanation was that the new base had encountered ground at the bottom of the sea to which it now adhered, and would continue to adhere unless the submerged part rose in the water so as to cause a second capsize. This complicated matters seriously, because the dangers of positive immobility were such that the chances of drifting were preferable. At least in the latter case there was some hope of coming across a continent or an island, or even, if the currents did not change, of crossing the boundaries of the austral region. Here we were, then, after 3 months of this terrible voyage. Was there now any question of trying to save William Guy, his comrades on the Jane, and Arthur Pym? Was it not for our own safety that any means at our disposal should be employed? And could it be wondered at were the sailors of the Halbrane to rebel? Were they to listen to Hearne's suggestion, and make their officers, or myself especially, responsible for the disasters of this expedition? Moreover, was it likely to take place, since, notwithstanding their losses, the followers of the sealing master were still a majority of the ship's company? The question, I could clearly see, was occupying the thoughts of Captain Len Guy and West. Again, although the recruits from the Falklands formed only a total of 14 men, as against the 12 of the old crew, was it not to be feared that some of the latter would take Hearne's side? What if Hearne's people, urged by despair, were already thinking of seizing the only boat we now possessed, setting off towards the north, and leaving us on this iceberg? It was then of great importance that our boat should be put in safety and closely watched. A marked change had taken place in Captain Len Guy since the recent occurrences. He seemed to be transformed upon finding himself face to face with the dangers which menaced us. Up to that time he had been solely occupied in searching for his fellow countrymen. He had handed over the command of the schooner to West, and he could not have given it to anyone more zealous and more capable. But from this date he resumed his position as master of the ship, and used it with the energy required by the circumstances. In a word, he again became sole master on board, after God. At his command the crew were drawn up around him on a flat spot a little to the left of the Halbrane. In that place the following were assembled: on the senior's side, Martin Holt and Hardy; Rogers, Francis, Gratian, Bury, Stern, the cook, Endicott, and I may add Dirk Peters; on the side of the newcomers, Hearne and the 13 other Falkland sailors. The latter composed a distinct group. The sealing master was their spokesman, and exercised a baneful influence over them. Captain Len Guy cast a stern glance upon the men, and said in a sharp tone, "Sailors of the Halbrane, I must first speak to you of our lost companions. 5 of us have just perished in this catastrophe." "We are waiting to perish in our turn in these seas. where we have been dragged in spite of " "Be silent, Hearne!" cried West, pale with anger. "Or if not " "Hearne has said what he had to say," Captain Len Guy continued coldly. "Now it is said, and I advise him not to interrupt me a second time." The sealing master might possibly have ventured on an answer, for he felt that he was backed by the majority of the crew, but Martin Holt held him back, and he was silent. Captain Len Guy then took off his hat and pronounced the following words with an emotion that affected us to the bottom of our hearts: "We must pray for those who have died in this dangerous voyage, which was undertaken in the name of humanity. May God be pleased to take into consideration the fact that they devoted their lives to their fellow creatures, and may He not be insensible to our prayers. Kneel down, sailors of the Halbrane." They all knelt down on the icy surface, and the murmurs of prayers ascended towards heaven. We waited for Captain Len Guy to rise before we did so. "Now," he resumed, "after those who are dead come those who have survived. To them I say that they must obey me, whatever my orders may be, and even in our present situation I shall not tolerate any hesitation or opposition. The responsibility for the general safety is mine, and I will not yield any of it to anyone. I am master here, as on board." "On board when there is no longer a ship," muttered the sealing master. "You are mistaken, Hearne. The vessel is there, and we will put it back into the sea. Besides, if we had only a boat, I am the captain of it. Let him beware who forgets this." That day Captain Len Guy, having taken the height of the sun by the sextant, and fixed the hour by the chronometer, both of these instruments had escaped destruction in the collision, obtained the following position of his ship: South latitude 88° 55', west longitude 39° 12'. The Halbrane was only at 1° 5', about 65 miles from the South Pole. "All hands to work," was the captain's order that afternoon, and every one obeyed it with a will. There was not a moment to lose, as the question of time was more important than any other. So far as provisions were concerned, there was enough in the schooner for 18 months on full rations, so we were not threatened with hunger, nor with thirst either, notwithstanding that, owing to water casks having been burst in the collision, their contents had escaped through their staves. Luckily the barrels of gin, whisky, beer, and wine, being placed in the least exposed part of the hold, were nearly all intact. Under this head we had experienced no loss, and the iceberg would supply us with good drinking water. It is a well known fact that ice, whether formed from fresh or salt water, contains no salt, owing to the chloride of sodium being eliminated in the change from liquid to the solid state. The origin of the ice, therefore, is a matter of no importance. However, those blocks which are easily distinguished by their green colour and their perfect transparency are preferable. They are solidified rain, and therefore much more suitable for drinking water. Without doubt our captain would have recognized any blocks of this description, but none were to be found on the glacier, owing to its being that part of the berg which was originally submerged and came to the top after the fall. The captain and West decided first to lighten the vessel by conveying everything on board to land. The masts were to be cleared of rigging, taken out, and placed on the plateau. It was necessary to lighten the vessel as much as possible, even to clear out the ballast, owing to the difficult and dangerous operation of launching. It would be better to put off our departure for some days if this operation could be performed under more favourable circumstances. The loading might afterwards be accomplished without much difficulty. Besides this, another reason, by no means less serious, presented itself to us. It would have been an act of unpardonable rashness to leave the provisions in the storeroom of the Halbrane, her situation on the side of the iceberg being very precarious. One shake would suffice to detach the ship, and with her would have disappeared the supplies on which our lives depended. On this account we passed the day in removing casks of half salted meat, dried vegetables, flour, biscuits, tea, coffee, barrels of gin, whisky, wine, and beer from the hold and storeroom, and placing them safely in the hammocks near the Halbrane. We also had to ensure our landing against any possible accident, and, I must add, against any plot on the part of Hearne and others to seize the boat in order to return to the ice barrier. We placed the long boat in a cavity which would be easy to watch, about 30 feet to the left of the schooner, along with its oars, rudder, compass, anchor, masts, and sail. By day there was nothing to fear, and at night, or rather during the hours of sleep, the boatswain and one of the superiors would keep guard near the cavity, and we might rest assured that no evil could befall. The 19th, 20th, and 21st of January were passed in working extra hard in the unshipping of the cargo, and the dismantling of the Halbrane. We slung the lower mast by means of yards forming props. Later on, West would see to replacing the main and the mizzen masts. In any case, we could do without them until we had reached the Falklands or some other winter port. Needless to say, we had set up a camp on the plateau of which I have spoken, not far from the Halbrane. Sufficient shelter against the inclemency of weather, not unfrequent at this time of the year, was to be found under tents constructed of sails placed on spars and fastened down by pegs. The glass remained set fair. The wind was northeast, the temperature having risen to 46 degrees (2.78 degrees Celsius). Endicott's kitchen was fitted up at the end of the plain, near a steep projection by which we could climb to the very top of the berg. It is only fair to state that during these 3 days of hard work no fault was to be found with Hearne. The sealing master knew he was being closely watched, and he was well aware that Captain Len Guy would not spare him if he tried to get up insubordination amongst his comrades. It was a pity that his bad instincts had induced him to play such a part, for his strength, skill, and cleverness made him a very valuable man, and he had never proved more useful than under these circumstances. Was he changed for the better? Did he understand that the general good feeling was necessary for the safety of all? I know not, but I had no confidence in him, neither had Hurliguerly. I need not dwell on the ardour with which the half breed did the rough work, always first to begin and the last to leave off, doing as much as 4 men, and scarcely sleeping, only resting during meals, which he took apart from the others. He had hardly spoken to me at all since the schooner had met with this terrible accident. What indeed could he say to me? Did I not know as well as he that it would be necessary to renounce every hope of pursuing our intended voyage? Now and again I noticed Martin Holt and the half breed near each other while some difficult piece of work was in progress. Our sailing master did not miss a chance of getting near Dirk Peters, who always tried his best to escape from him, for reasons well known to me. And whenever I thought of the secret of the fate of the so called Parker, Martin Holt's brother, which had been entrusted to me, that dreadful scene of the Grampus filled me with horror. I was certain that if this secret were made known, the half breed would become an object of terror. He would no longer be looked upon as the rescuer of the sailing master, and the latter, learning that his brother luckily Dirk Peters and myself were the only two acquainted with the fact. While the Halbrane was being unloaded, Captain Len Guy and the mate were considering how the vessel might be launched. They had to allow for a drop of 100 feet between the cavity in which the ship lay and the sea, this to be effected by means of an inclined bed hollowed in an oblique line along the west side of the iceberg, and to measure 200 or 300 perches in length. So, while the first lot of men, commanded by the boatswain, was unloading the schooner, a second batch, under West's orders, began to cut the trench between the blocks which covered the side of the floating mountain. Floating, I know not why I use this expression, for the iceberg no longer floated, but remained as motionless as an island. There was nothing to indicate that it would ever move again. Other icebergs drifted along and past us, going southeast, whilst ours, to use Dirk Peters' expression, was lying to. Would its base be sufficiently undermined to allow it to detach itself? Perhaps some heavy mass of ice might strike it and set it free by the shock. No one could predict such an event, and we had only the Halbrane to lie upon for getting us out of these regions. We were engaged in these various tasks until the 24th of January. The atmosphere was clear, the temperature was even, and the thermometer had indeed gone up 2 or 3 degrees above freezing point. The number of icebergs coming from the north-west was therefore increasing. There were now 100 of them, and a collision with any of these might have a most disastrous result. Hardy, the caulker, hastened first of all to mend the hull. Pegs had to be changed, bits of planking to be replaced, seams to be caulked. We had everything that was necessary for this work, and we might rest assured that it would be performed in the best possible manner. In the midst of the silence of these solitudes, the noise of the hammers striking the nails into the side, and the sound of the mallet stuffing tow into the seams, had a startling effect. Sea gulls, wild ducks, albatross, and petrels flew in a circle round the top of the berg, with a shrill screaming, and made a terrible uproar. When I found myself with West and the captain, our conversation naturally turned on our situation and how to get out of it, and upon our chances of pulling through. The mate had good hopes that if no accident occurred the launching would be successfully accomplished. The captain was more reserved on the subject, but at the thought that he would have to renounce all hope of finding the survivors of the Jane, his heart was ready to break. When the Halbrane should be ready again for the sea, and West should inquire what course he was to steer, would Captain Len Guy dare to reply "to the south"? No, for he would not be followed either by the new hands or by the greater portion of the old members of the crew. To continue our search in this direction, to go beyond the Pole, without being certain of reaching the Indian Ocean instead of the Atlantic, would have been rashness of which no navigator would be guilty. If a continent bound the sea on this side, the schooner would run the danger of being crushed by the mass of ice before it could escape the southern winter. Under such circumstances, to attempt to persuade Captain Len Guy to pursue the voyage would only be to court a certain refusal. It could not even be proposed, now that necessity obliged us to return northwards, and not to delay a single day in this portion of the Antarctic regions. At any rate, though I resolved not again to speak of the matter to the captain, I lost no opportunity of sounding the boatswain. Often when he had finished his work, Hurliguerly would come and join me; we would chat, and we would compare our recollections of travel. CHAPTER 20.